I'm in the water. The parachute silk is wrapped around my legs and pulling me down. I can taste aviation fuel on my lips. There is a deep gash across my scalp, and the blood is running into my left eye, so I can only see out of the right one. Every time a wave lifts me, I catch a glimpse of the smoke trail my Corsair left going into Rabaul harbor. It is still burning down there, 30 feet under, upside down on the harbor floor. Somewhere above me, the man I promised to protect, my wingman, George Ashmun, 23 years old from Trenton, New Jersey, is already dead. I saw his plane roll over and dive straight into the water. I couldn't help him. I'm 8 miles from a Japanese naval base. I have $2,600 in debt back home in Seattle that I will probably never repay. I'm 31 years old. I'm the top scoring Marine ace in the Pacific, and in a few hours a Japanese submarine will surface out of this harbor and pull me out of the water. Nobody in America will know I'm alive for 20 months. This is how I became a ghost. To understand how I ended up bleeding in Rabaul harbor with a Japanese submarine coming for me, you have to go back 11 months. You have to go back to a mud-soaked island in the New Hebrides called Espiritu Santo. And before you meet the men, you have to meet the machine, because this is not just my story. It is the story of a fighter plane the United States Navy did not want. The Vought F4U Corsair was born on a drawing board in 1938. A young engineer named Rex Basil gave it the biggest engine he could find. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. To swing enough propeller to bite that much power, he needed a blade 13 feet 4 inches across. And to keep those 13 feet of propeller from chewing the runway, he bent the wings. That is why the Corsair looked the way it did. The inverted gull wing was not art. It was arithmetic. On October 1st, 1940, the prototype hit 405 miles per hour in level flight, the first American fighter to break 400. Faster than anything Mitsubishi had, faster than anything the Germans had. On paper, she was a killer. Then the Navy tried to land her on a carrier deck. The long nose blocked the pilot's view over the cowl. The landing gear bounced like a rubber ball on a concrete floor. Rookie ensigns, fresh out of Pensacola, floated her too high, dropped her too hard, and cartwheeled across the deck in a shower of aluminum. The dead ones got a folded flag. The survivors gave the airplane a new name. They called her the Ensign Eliminator. So, in the fall of 1942, the United States Navy did something almost unheard of. They took the fastest fighter America had ever built, and they threw her off their aircraft carriers, handed her to the Marines, told them to fly her from crushed coral runways in the jungle. That is the machine. Now meet the man. His name on his Marine Corps paperwork read Gregory Boyington. But his real name, the name on the birth certificate his mother tried to hide from him, was Gregory Hallenbeck. His mother divorced his father in a small lumber town in Idaho and married a man named Boyington. She never told the boy. He grew up thinking Boyington was his blood. He found out the truth in the mid-1930s when he applied to become a Marine cadet. The Marine Corps required a birth certificate. There was no birth certificate for a Gregory Hallenbeck. There was a birth certificate for a Gregory Boyington, born December 4th, 1412, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. His mother finally confessed, and here is the strange thing. That accidental discovery saved his career. The Marine Corps had a rule: no married cadets. Boyington was already married, but the Marine Corps had no record of a Gregory Boyington being married to anyone. So he signed the paperwork under his real name, kept his wife hidden, and became a Marine. He was a liar before he was a pilot. By 1941, he was drowning. 3 children, a crumbling marriage, $2,600 in debt, which in 1941 was enough to buy a house. His superiors were building a case to push him out of the Corps. He was drinking hard, some days harder. He was, by any measure the Marine Corps used, a failure. Then one night in the summer of 1941, in a hotel bar in Pensacola, he cashed a bad check for $20, and a stranger upstairs offered him a way out. A retired Army pilot named Claire Chenault was recruiting for a secret unit, American volunteers who would fly for the Chinese government against the Japanese in Burma. The pay was 3 times a Marine major's salary, $500 cash for every Japanese plane you shot down. Boyington signed the paper before he finished his second drink. He resigned his Marine Corps commission on August 27, 1941, and sailed for Rangoon. And that is how a broke lieutenant in a hotel bar became a flying tiger. He was not a good flying tiger. He fought with Chenault. He drank. He pulled a rickshaw down the main street of a Burmese town, drunk out of his mind, with a fellow pilot riding in the back. His squadron mates called him the man they left alone. The official Flying Tigers records credit him with 3.5 kills. Boyington always claimed 6. Nobody, not even his defenders, was ever quite sure which number was true. In the summer of 1942, he walked out of Burma without permission, bought his own passage on a ship back to the United States, sailed home to a country that was now at war. He expected the Marine Corps to welcome him back. They did not. He spent months living with his mother and stepfather in Washington State. Months while every pilot he had ever known was fighting at Midway, at Guadalcanal, in the Solomons. He couldn't find work. He ended up parking cars in a downtown Seattle garage, wearing a greasy uniform, taking tips from businessmen who didn't know they were handing quarters to a combat pilot with kills to his name. One night, after a bottle of bourbon, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. He told Western Union to send it as a telegram. He inflated his Flying Tigers record. He claimed he begged for a commission. Within days, the Marine Corps reinstated him, promoted him to major. Nobody ever explained why. By August 1943, they had shipped him to Espiritu Santo and buried him behind a desk. He was the officer nobody knew what to do with. 30 years old, grey at the temples, a face already lined by rum and regret. The younger pilots called him old. They called him Pappy. And then the war did him a favor. A telegram came down from Marine Air Wing headquarters. The frontline squadrons in the Solomons needed replacement pilots, but the paperwork had gotten jammed up. Corsair airframes were parked in revetments with nobody to fly them. Trained pilots were scattered across a dozen units with nobody to lead them. Somebody needed to put the two together. Pappy Boyington walked into his old friend Sandy Sanderson's office and asked for permission to build a squadron out of the leftovers. Sanderson said yes. That is how it started. Not with a plan, not with a speech, just a broken major and a stack of orphan pilots nobody else wanted. They gathered in a tent at Turtle Bay in September 1943. 26 pilots. Some had never flown a Corsair. Some had never flown in combat. Some had. There were kids like John Bolt from Florida, 22 years old, who had been an instructor stateside. There was Chris, 26 years old, who had flown with the Royal Canadian Air Force before the American service brought him home. There was Paul Mullen, who they called Moon, a poet who wrote verses about Rabaul between missions. There was Bill Case, 22, who had already earned a kill flying with another squadron. There was George Ashmoon, 23 years old, Trenton, New Jersey. Quiet, serious, a good stick. He would fly wing on Pappy Boyington for the rest of his very short life. They sat in the tent that night and argued about what to call themselves. Somebody said Boyington's bastards, because they had no real parent squadron, no equipment of their own, and a commanding officer who fit the name. Everybody laughed. Everybody agreed. The next morning, they took it to the Marine Corps Public Information Officer, a captain named Jack Deschamps. Deschamps read the name. He shook his head. No newspaper in America will print that word. Moon Mullen thought about it for a while. Then he stood up and said one thing. Then we're the Black Sheep. The insignia was drawn that afternoon. A shield, a black sheep, and running diagonally across it, a black stripe. In heraldry, that stripe has a name. It is called the Bar Sinister. It is the ancient mark of illegitimate birth. The bastards had become the Black Sheep, and they wore the mark of illegitimacy on their planes. Now they just had to prove they belonged in the sky. The first thing Pappy Boyington did was teach us how not to die. He gathered us in the tent at Turtle Bay on a wet September evening. The rain was hammering on the canvas overhead. He had a piece of chalk and a plank of scrap wood, and on that plank he drew two airplanes. One was a Mitsubishi A6M0. The other was our F4U Corsair. He looked around at 26 faces, most of them under 25 years old. "You are flying one of the sweetest fighters in the sky," he said. "But there are certain things a Corsair will not do. It will not outturn a Zero. It will not outclimb a Zero at low speed. If you try, you will die." He tapped the chalk against the wood. "Here is what she will do. She will outrun him. She will outdive him. And she will outshoot him. 650 caliber Brownings in the wings. One burst, and a Zero comes apart like tin foil." He set the chalk down. "Get above him. Dive on him. One pass. Break away. Climb back up. Never turn with a Zero. Never. If you turn with a Zero, you go home in a wooden box." Nobody spoke for a long time. Outside, the rain kept coming. That was the only lecture we ever got. The next day, we started flying. 2 weeks of practice missions, formation work, gunnery runs against tow targets. Pappy watched us from the ground, chewing on a cigar, and at the end of every day he told us the same thing. Faster, rougher, meaner. The Japanese pilots up there have been at war for 4 years. They have killed more men than any of us have ever met. You will not outthink them. You will outshoot them, or you will die. On September 12, 1943, our combat tour officially began. On September 14th, we flew our first mission out of Munda Airfield on New Georgia, a chunk of jungle that our CBs were still rebuilding while the Japanese still held the far end of the runway. It was a routine bomber escort. No contact. We came home with clean guns. 2 days later, on September 16th, everything changed. The mission was a bomber escort. Navy dive bombers and TBF Avengers hitting a Japanese airstrip on the island of Ballet at the southern tip of Bougainville. Corsairs of the Black Sheep flew top cover at 20,000 feet. It was 1 in the afternoon. The sky was clear. At the target, we saw them. Roughly 30 Mitsubishi Zeros. From the 204th and 201st Kokutai, the Japanese Navy's most experienced fighter groups, climbing to meet us. Some of those pilots had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. Some of them had shot down British Buffaloes over Malaya, Dutch Hurricanes over Java, American Wildcats over Guadalcanal. They were the professionals. We were 20-something orphans who had trained together for 2 weeks. Pappy peeled off first. He came down out of the sun in a howling dive, the R-2800 screaming, the airframe shuddering. He picked a Zero at the top of the enemy formation. One burst. The Zero exploded. He kept diving straight through the middle of them, guns hammering, and came out below the fight at 10,000 feet. He climbed. He did it again. By the time the dogfight was over, 30 minutes had passed. The sky over Balale looked like a snowstorm of smoke trails and burning aircraft, and Pappy Boyington had shot down 5 Zeros in a single mission, 5 in one flight. Only a handful of Marines in the entire war would ever do it. He was the first to do it in a Corsair. The squadron claimed 11 confirmed kills that day, 8 probable. We lost nobody. When we landed back at Munda, the Marine ground crews came running out to look at us. We climbed down out of our Corsairs, still shaking, still smelling of cordite and sweat. Pappy hopped off the wing of his airplane, looked at his mechanic, and asked for a cigarette. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He walked to the debrief tent and started writing his after-action report. That was the day the Black Sheep stopped being bastards. The next 6 weeks were a blur of blood and coral dust. We flew from Munda, then moved north to Baracoma, on the island of Vella La Vella, closer to the fighting, closer to Rabaul. The runways were crushed coral, blinding white under the tropical sun. Our tents leaked. Our clothes never dried. The mosquitoes came in clouds thick enough to choke a horse, and half the squadron came down with malaria before the tour was over. We ate spam. Spam in the morning, spam at noon, spam at night. Sometimes Vienna sausage for variety. A pilot named Bourgeois once opened a can of spam and stared at it for a full minute before he started laughing. He kept laughing until he was crying. Nobody said anything. We understood. The fighting never stopped. Chris McGee, Wild Man McGee we called him, though never to his face, because he was built like a heavyweight and lifted weights in the sun for exercise, earned his nickname on a September afternoon over a Navy convoy near Vella La Vella. Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers were rolling in on our ships. McGee was at 13,000 feet. He rolled his Corsair onto its back and dove straight down through the middle of the American anti-aircraft fire. He was inside the flak envelope of his own ships when he opened up. He flamed one Val on the way down. He flamed another as they pulled up over the water. Then he heard bullets hitting his aircraft like a hailstorm on a tin roof. The Zeros escorting the Vals had finally caught him. He broke away and ran for home at wave-top height. When he landed at Munda, the ground crew counted 30 bullet holes in his Corsair. He was recommended for the Navy Cross. He got it. 2 weeks later, escorting bombers over a place called Choiseul, McGee saw a Japanese supply junk on the water, a 70-foot wooden vessel loaded with soldiers. Corsairs are not designed to sink boats. 650 calibers will splinter the deck, but not always the hull. McGee had a solution. He carried an unauthorized hand grenade in his cockpit. He rolled in on the junk, pulled the pin with his teeth on the second try, and dropped the grenade out the open canopy at 50 feet. It somehow landed on the deck of the junk. The grenade went off as the Corsairs raked the boat with machine gun fire. They left it burning and flew home. Nobody wrote that mission up. Nobody wanted to explain why a fighter pilot had a grenade in his cockpit. Then there was Bill Case, 22 years old. On a late October fighter sweep over Kahili, a Zero got behind him. A single 7.7mm round punched through the plexiglass of his canopy. It was aimed at the back of his head, but Bill Case had done something strange that morning. When he strapped into his Corsair, he had reached down and lowered his seat by 1 notch. He could not tell you why. He had never done it before. He would never do it again. The bullet passed over his skull and creased his scalp. Blood ran down his face. He flew home half-blind and landed one-handed. The Navy corpsman shaved his head and stitched him up in 20 minutes. 1 notch, about 2 inches. That was the margin between Bill Case going home after the war and Bill Case being wrapped in a poncho and buried in a hole in the jungle. We did not talk about that kind of thing. But at night, in our tents, we thought about it. Every time a bunk went empty, we thought about it. That is what nobody tells you about a fighter squadron. The empty bunks. You come home from a mission, you count the airplanes on the ramp, and if there's one missing, you walk into your tent, and there is a Marine sitting on the floor, going through a footlocker. He is dividing up the missing man's things, his shaving kit, his toothbrush, his writing paper, a photograph of his mother that he kept in the lining of his flight helmet. The living get the shaving kit, the dead get an envelope home. 6 weeks of fighting, 57 confirmed kills, 19 probable. And 4 names we would not say out loud anymore. Admiral William Halsey, Bull Halsey himself, commander of the entire South Pacific, flew down to Espiritu Santo to shake our hands one by one. He stood in front of Pappy and told him the Marine Corps was submitting him for the Medal of Honor. Pappy did not know how to answer. He shook the Admiral's hand. He walked back to his tent. He did not talk about it. That was late October, 1943. Our first tour was over. They flew us south to Sydney, Australia, for a week of leave. Sydney was another world. Clean sheets, cold beer, women in wool sweaters who spoke English with a strange lilt. We drank in the long mahogany bar of the Hotel Australia in downtown Sydney, and there was a bartender named Freda who was rationed 1 bottle of scotch a night. If you got there early enough, you could talk her into lining up 4 glasses at once and pouring the whole bottle across them. When the bell rang for the scotch to end, you slammed all 4 glasses and moved down the bar for bourbon. Pappy vanished for most of the week. We would see him at the parties at night, red-faced, laughing, picking fights with whoever was biggest in the room. In the daytime, nobody knew where he went. He came back to the hotel each dawn, showered, ate breakfast, and started drinking again. Nobody judged him. In Sydney, in November of 1943, nobody had the right to judge anybody. We flew back to the Solomons at the end of the month. New pilots had been added to the squadron, replacements to fill the empty bunks, bringing us to 40 men. And the target had changed. The target was now Rabaul. Rabaul was a fortress. It sat on the northern tip of the island of New Britain, guarding the entrance to the entire Southwest Pacific. The Japanese had turned it into the largest military base out their home islands, roughly 100,000 troops. 5 airfields, Vunakanau, Lakunai, Tobera, Rapopo, and Keravat. Hundreds of combat aircraft, anti-aircraft guns thicker than any of us had ever seen. A harbor full of warships. Rabaul was where the Japanese Navy's best fighter pilots came to die well. We moved forward again to Torokina on Bougainville, a raw airstrip carved out of jungle so recently that we were flying combat missions while Seabees were still bulldozing revetments and Marines on the ground were still killing Japanese soldiers a mile from the runway. At night, we heard rifle fire, sometimes machine gun fire, sometimes screaming. We were living inside the war. Pappy started taunting the Japanese over the radio. He would circle over Rabaul at high altitude, cut in on the Japanese fighter control frequency, and dare them to come up. He gave them his name. He gave them his squadron number. One afternoon in late 1943, a Japanese voice answered him in English. "Why don't you come down, Major Boyington?" We heard it over the radio. Every man in the flight heard it. Pappy laughed and pushed the throttle forward and went hunting. He was becoming famous. Correspondents were flying into Torokina to interview him. Life magazine wanted photographs. There was a running tally in the American newspapers. How many kills Pappy Boyington had, how close he was to the American record. 26 kills. That was the number to beat. 26 was the number held by Marine Corps Captain Joe Foss, who had shot down 26 Japanese planes over Guadalcanal the year before. Pappy was closing on 26 fast. Every mission, the reporters gathered at the flight line to count. And Pappy, the drunk, the alcoholic, The man who fought his own officers as often as he fought the Japanese became a national hero. There was a Marine colonel at group headquarters named Joe Smoke. He hated Pappy Boyington. He hated the drinking. He hated the reporters. He hated the fact that a broken-down major was getting Life magazine covers while proper Marine officers were following regulations and dying in obscurity. In December, Smoke tried to transfer Pappy off flight duty, put him behind a desk, tried to tell him the Black Sheep would finish their tour without him. Pappy went around Smoke. He caught a transport to headquarters and went straight to an old friend, a general named James Moore, and asked for a second tour of combat. Moore said yes, overruled Smoke. Smoke was insane with rage. He dug through the regulations. He found an obscure Marine Corps rule stating that a junior officer could not visit group headquarters on personal business without written permission. He used that rule to place Pappy Boyington under arrest. They confined him to his quarters, told him he could not visit the officers' club, told him he could not leave the base. Pappy waited. Then he slipped away, climbed aboard a transport aircraft heading north, and flew himself back to the war. Colonel Joe Smoke never forgave him. The Marine Corps did not care. By the end of December, the pace of the fighting was destroying us. We were flying every day, bomber escorts to Rabaul, fighter sweeps to Rabaul, strafing runs on Japanese barges in the harbors around Rabaul. The Zeros were coming up in numbers we had never seen before, 50, 60, 70 at a time. In 1 week alone, we lost 6 pilots. On December 27th, Pappy shot down his 25th Zero. He was one behind Joe Foss. The reporters at Torokina were beside themselves. Every day, they crowded the flight line waiting for Pappy to land, waiting to see if he had gotten number 26. He did not. 28 December, nothing. 29 December, nothing. 30 December, nothing. 31 December, nothing. January 1st, 1944, nothing. January 2nd, engine trouble. He turned back over the water. On the night of January 2nd, Pappy Boyington sat down in the officer's tent and wrote a letter to his mother in Idaho. I have read that letter. In it, he does not sound like a hero. He wrote to her that the Japanese were getting tough. He wrote that he did not know if he would break the record before his tour ended. He wrote a line that has stayed with me for 40 years. As you have always taught me, nothing is worthwhile unless you earn it. He sealed the envelope. He walked outside. He looked at the stars over the Solomons, and he went to bed early. The next morning was January 3rd, 1944. He did not drink the night before. He slept a full 6 hours. That never happened. Pappy always slept badly and drank until midnight, but that one night, before that one mission, he slept. He climbed into his F4U Corsair. He would fly with a 23-year-old first lieutenant from Trenton, New Jersey, George Ashmoon. The mission was a fighter sweep over Rabaul. Nearly 50 Marine Corsairs and Navy Hellcats, the largest fighter sweep of Pappy's career. Weather clear, winds light. They took off from Torokina at 6:30 in the morning. At 20,000 feet over the Japanese airfield at Rapopo, Pappy spotted Zeros climbing to meet them. He rolled inverted, pulled down through the nose, and dove. He shot down 3, 26 kills, then 27, then 28. He had tied Joe Foss's record. He had beaten it. He would not know it for 20 months. Somewhere in the middle of the fight, no one on our side saw exactly how it happened. A swarm of Zeros got between Pappy and Ashman's and the rest of the formation. 2 Corsairs against many. Ashman caught fire first. His Corsair went straight down, trailing black smoke. He rode it all the way to the water. 23 years old. Trenton, New Jersey. His body was never recovered. Pappy's fuel tank caught a burst of cannon fire. Flames came up through the floor of the cockpit. He rolled the Corsair inverted, jettisoned the canopy, and fell out into the sky above Rabaul harbor. His parachute opened. He hit the water, broken and bleeding. He drifted for hours in the harbor, while enemy fighters swept overhead. Eventually, a Japanese submarine surfaced beside him and pulled him aboard. By noon at Torokiokina, the Black Sheep had returned without him. By nightfall, the wire services had the story. By the next morning, Pappy Boyington was missing in action, presumed killed. The Marine Corps began drafting his Medal of Honor citation. Frank Walton, our intelligence officer, sat in the operations tent at Torokina that night and wrote a letter to his wife. He wrote something I have never forgotten. He wrote, "We all miss the skipper, but even more important than our personal loss is the loss to combat aviation. Someday I can tell you more, but he was the dean of all combat pilots. We loved him and respected him, and our boys were all willing to die for and with him, and some of them did." 5 days later, on January 8, 1944, the Black Sheep flew our last combat mission of the war. We were done. The squadron was disbanded. The pilots were scattered into the replacement pool. The name Black Sheep was given to a brand new group of pilots training in California, men who had never met Pappy Boyington, men who had never flown from a jungle runway, men who would never sit in our tent at Turtle Bay and eat cold spam by lantern light. They would inherit our name. They would inherit something else, too, something none of us could have imagined. They would inherit our death. By the middle of January 1944, the original Black Sheep had ceased to exist. 84 days of combat. That was all we had been given. In those 84 days, we shot down 94 Japanese aircraft. We claimed 35 more as probable. We destroyed or damaged another 74 on the ground or on the water. 203 enemy planes accounted for in less than 3 months. 9 of us became aces: Pappy Boyington, Chris McGee, John Bolt, Bill Case, Paul Mullen, Bob McClurg, Don Fisher, Ed Harper, and one more, depending on how the Marine Corps finally tallied the paperwork. 9 of us did not come home. 9 empty bunks. 9 envelopes going out to 9 American mothers. The Presidential Unit citation came through in the spring. A framed piece of paper signed by President Roosevelt, praising the Black Sheep Squadron for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy. Most of us never saw it in person. Most of us were on other islands by then, flying with other units, killing other Japanese, watching other men die in other cockpits. The squadron number 214 was reassigned to a fresh batch of pilots training at Marine Corps Air Station, Santa Barbara, California. They had never heard of Torokina. They had never smelled cordite in a Corsair cockpit. They had never watched a friend burn. They inherited our name. And here is where the story turns. Because during that same year, while the new VMF 214 was learning to fly, something extraordinary was happening with the airplane we had left behind. The Corsair, the Ensign Eliminator, the fighter the United States Navy had thrown off its aircraft carriers in disgust, was quietly being redeemed. British test pilots of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, who had received Corsairs under Lend-Lease, worked out a technique the American Navy had never tried. They called it a curved approach. Instead of coming straight in over the round down with a nose that blocked the view, they flew a long, slow, turning arc onto the carrier deck. From that angle, the pilot could see everything he needed to see, right up until the moment his wheels kissed the wood. They fixed the landing gear. They raised the pilot's seat. They lengthened the tail wheel. The airplane the American Navy had rejected became one of the finest carrier fighters of the war. By early 1945, the new Black Sheep were carrier qualified. They boarded the aircraft carrier USS Franklin on February 4, 1945, as part of Carrier Air Group 5. Their Corsairs, the same airplane, redesigned, redeemed, sat on the flight deck of one of the largest warships in the United States Navy, bound for the coast of Japan. The Franklin was heading closer to the Japanese home islands than any American carrier had ever gone. 50 miles off the coast of Honshu. That was the distance on the morning of March 19, 1945. At around 7 o'clock in the morning, 12 pilots of VMF-214 were already in the air. They had launched at dawn for a fighter sweep against airfields on the Japanese mainland. 12 more Black Sheep pilots were still on the Franklin, gathered in the ready room, waiting for the next launch. The flight deck was crowded, Corsairs and Hellcats and Helldivers, fully fueled, fully armed, engines being warmed, propellers turning slowly in the salt breeze. At about 7 o'clock in the morning, a single Japanese Yokosuka D4Y dive bomber, a fast, sleek aircraft the Americans called Judy, slipped through the low clouds and dropped 2 armor-piercing bombs on the deck of the Franklin. The first bomb pierced the flight deck along the center line and exploded in the hangar deck below. The second bomb tore through the aft section into the middle of a cluster of fueled and armed aircraft ready for launch. The Franklin became a floating volcano. Fuel tanks ruptured, bombs cooked off, rockets ignited and shot across the hangar deck like meteors. 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs began exploding one after another. The ship listed 13 degrees to starboard. She lost all communications. She went dead in the water 50 miles from Japan. In the ready room, 11 of the 12 Black Sheep pilots waiting for briefing were killed. By the time the fires were controlled, the Franklin had lost 724 men killed, 265 wounded. 32 of the dead were Black Sheep, pilots, ground crew, and ordnance men. The new VMF-214 was gone, wiped out in a single morning. The airplane that killed them was a D4Y Judy. And here is the last twist of the war. The 12 Black Sheep pilots who had launched at dawn, the ones already airborne when the bombs fell, were the ones who came home. And one of them, a first lieutenant named Ken Linder, was credited with a half share in shooting down the D4Y Judy that had attacked their own ship. The men who had inherited our name had watched their own aircraft carrier die, and one of them had killed the killer. The name Black Sheep would not fly in combat again during the Second World War. 7,000 miles away, in a prisoner of war camp outside Tokyo, a broken man was still alive. Pappy Boyington had spent 20 in Japanese captivity. He had been shuffled from Rabaul to Truk, to Saipan, to Iwo Jima, to a camp called Afuna near Yokohama, and finally to a camp called Omori in Tokyo Bay. He had been starved, he had been beaten, he had watched other prisoners die of dysentery and untreated wounds and simple hopelessness. He had also, remarkably, made a friend. At Ofuna, in the same camp for a time, was a former Olympic runner named Louis Zamperini, the same Zamperini who had run the 5,000 meters at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. The same Zamperini whose bomber had crashed in the Pacific and who had drifted 47 days on a life raft before being captured. 2 American ghosts, both presumed dead by their families, both alive in the same Japanese prison. Nobody in America knew Pappy was alive. His mother had received the telegram. The Marine Corps had drafted the citation. The Medal of Honor had been approved posthumously. He was, on paper, a dead hero. Then, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan. 2 weeks later, an American aircraft flew low over the prison camp at Omori, taking photographs. The photographs came back to a developing lab aboard a Navy carrier. A young intelligence officer looked at one of the prints and saw something painted across the roof of a barracks in white. Pappy Boyington, here. He had painted it himself, along with several other prisoners, in the frantic hours after they learned the war was over. The news traveled up the chain of command in a matter of hours. It reached the highest levels of the Navy Department. Somewhere in Washington, a clerk pulled the Medal of Honor citation out of the archive. He was alive. He was coming home. A former governor of Minnesota, then serving as a Navy commander, named Harold Stassen, was among the officers who walked into Omori after the surrender. He found Pappy Boyington gaunt, filthy, wearing rags. Pappy had lost 60 pounds. His hair had gone grey in captivity. He was 32 years old, and he looked 50. They put him aboard a hospital ship. They fed him. They deloused him. They gave him clean sheets for the first time in 20 months, and then they flew him home. He came into San Francisco Bay in September of 1945. Someone from the Marine Corps had found every surviving black sheep in the continental United States and flown them into the city ahead of him. They were waiting at the Sir Francis Drake Hotel. 20-some men who had thought their commanding officer was dead for almost 2 years. They threw a party that lasted 3 days. Years later, Bob McClurg would tell a reporter, "I still have a hangover from it." The Marine Corps sent Pappy on a war bond tour across the country. In every town he visited, crowds turned out to see him. The drunk, the deserter, the bar fighter, the parking lot attendant who had become the top Marine ace of the war. In Seattle, the city where he had once parked cars for tips, they closed the streets. On October 8, 1945, in a ceremony on the White House lawn, President Harry Truman placed the Congressional Medal of Honor around Pappy Boyington's neck. That should be the end of the story. But it isn't, because the rest of Pappy Boyington's life was hard. His first marriage ended. So did his second, and his third. He drank himself into hospitals. He filed for bankruptcy. He wrote a memoir in 1958 called Black Sheep, and he made money from it, and much of the money went to whiskey. The book was largely about himself. It gave very little credit to the men who had flown with him, men like Chris Magee and John Bolt and Frank Walton, and those men noticed. In 1986, Frank Walton finally wrote his own book, Once They Were Eagles, a book about the other men who had made VMF 214 what it was. Pappy did not object. He was fading by then. He died on January 11, 1988, of cancer in a hospital in Fresno, California. He was 75 years old. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 7A, near the Memorial Amphitheater. His stone is simple. His name is spelled Gregory Boyington, not the name he was born with, but the name he chose. The airplane he flew went on without him. Vought and Goodyear and Brewster together built 12,571 Corsairs before production finally stopped in 1953. The longest production run of any American piston fighter in history. The Corsair fought again in Korea. Some of the last combat missions ever flown by a propeller-driven fighter in a modern war were flown by Corsairs over Central America in 1969. The men who flew it went on too. John Bolt, 22 years old in the tent at Turtle Bay, went to Korea 8 years later and shot down 6 MiG-15s in an F-86 Sabre on an exchange tour with the Air Force. He became the first jet ace in Marine Corps history. He remains one of the very few Marines to make ace in 2 different wars. Chris Magee left the Marines. He drifted. In 1946, he was arrested for armed robbery, a bank job he later said was meant to raise money for a foreign cause he believed in. He served time. He was pardoned. He died in obscurity years later. Frank Walton kept writing. He made sure nobody was forgotten. The rest of us grew old. The rest of us buried each other. If you ask me now, decades after that first mission over Balale, what the Black Sheep were, I will tell you this. We were not the movie. We were not the television show. We were not the legend that grew up around a broken, brilliant man who could fight better drunk than most men could fight sober. We were pilots the Marine Corps did not know what to do with. We were flying an airplane the Navy did not want. We were led by an officer they were about to throw out of the service, and in 84 days, we shot down 94 Japanese aircraft. We did not win the war. We were one squadron in a war with thousands of squadrons. There were better pilots. There were braver pilots. There were more important battles. But there was only one Black Sheep Squadron, and the mark we carried, the black stripe of illegitimacy, the bar sinister that Paul Mullen and Napkin in a tent one night in September of 1943 became, in the end, a mark of honor. We were the bastards. We were the ones nobody wanted. We were the ones who flew.